A course on nutrition would not be complete without a chapter on metabolism. It's often the chapter that students are most weary about, but it's actually quite important. After digestion and absorption comes the transformation of glucose molecule into energy the body can actually use. We've discussed at full length the digestion of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. The concept of digestion is to take one really large molecule and to break it down into the most basic of components. For example, a starch molecule will be broken down to individual glucose molecule. A protein will be broken down into individual amino acids. Once the large molecule is broken down into the components, these components can then be absorbed through the intestinal lining and travel through the bloodstream. They then will travel to the cells of the body to provide energy. The series of chemical reactions that take the energy from the macronutrients and convert it into energy the body can use is called metabolism. Because those three macronutrients are rich sources of energy, but it's not actually the type of energy that the body can use. The type of energy or the currency that the body uses is called ATP. ATP for adenosine triphosphate. A molecule of adenosine linked to 3 phosphates. This last bond here, this little animation ruined it, but this last bond between the 2 phosphates is very high energy. When the body breaks up the bond, it releases the type of energy that the body can actually use to stay alive or for whatever function it needs. So the conversion of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is the currency the body uses to stay alive. So the purpose of metabolism is to take, in this case, we'll talk about glucose, so to take a glucose molecule and to transform it into ATP. Glucose is a bit unique because it can produce ATP through 2 different metabolisms, through different streams. Anaerobic and aerobic. Anaerobic occurs in the absence of oxygen, whereas aerobic occurs in the presence of oxygen. When would you ever need energy in the absence of oxygen? Well, anytime you need energy quickly and oxygen cannot be provided to the cell. Anytime there's high intensity, for example, you're jogging for 30 kilometers, well, you're breathing the whole time, producing energy aerobically. But if I ask you to sprint as fast as you can for 20 meters, you'll need a lot of energy, but your breathing won't have time to catch up to provide your cells with enough oxygen. So you're producing energy anaerobically. Through anaerobic metabolism is one set of chemical reaction called glycolysis, and aerobic respiration occurs through 3 different sets of chemical reactions. Glycolysis, citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Let's start with anaerobic, or the process of glycolysis. So remember, metabolic pathways, all these pathways I'm going to talk about, are just clusters of chemical reactions that occur in sequence to achieve a particular goal. A set of chemical reactions that break down glucose to provide us with energy. Now, glycolysis is going to occur in a specific part of the cell. I think on page 241 there's a picture, a very simplified picture of a cell. A cell has a membrane, and within the membrane is cytosol. It's a cell interior, it's a fluid-like environment. Well, glycolysis occurs in the cytosol, in the cytoplasm, that watery environment of the cell. The goal of glycolysis is to take the glucose molecule and to break it down into pyruvate. Glucose molecules typically have 6 carbons, and pyruvate 3 carbons, so you can create 2 molecules of pyruvate. Through the process of breaking down glucose into pyruvate, you actually produce 2 ATPs. That's good, but it's not enough. The process of glycolysis also releases an electron. Electrons are captured by electron shuttles. So NAD, for example, traps the electron and brings it on to another step of metabolism, which we'll talk about later. What happens to this pyruvate molecule then depends whether we're in the aerobic environment or the anaerobic environment. Here's an image of glucose. So glucose enters the cell through cell transport proteins, goes through 12 chemical reactions called glycolysis, and you end up with pyruvate. In the absence of oxygen, pyruvate will be exposed to lactate dehydrogenase to produce lactate molecules. Lactate, that might be familiar, perhaps lactic acid. Lactic acid can accumulate when you have very high intensity exercise. Lactic acid won't circulate in your body forever. Basically, lactic acid produced from anaerobic glycolysis will travel through the bloodstream to the liver and be reconverted back into glucose. The glucose will re-enter the muscle and energy can again be created. If there is oxygen, pyruvate is going to be changed with the help of pyruvate dehydrogenase into acetyl-CoA. Now, this takes place in the matrix of the mitochondria. The mitochondria is a small organelle within the cell responsible for respiration. Once pyruvate is changed into acetyl-CoA, there's no going back. You can't change it back into glucose like you could with lactate. Acetyl-CoA will travel into the mitochondria and then continue on to the next step of metabolism to produce more ATP because 2 just wasn't enough. Now, glycolysis took place in the cytosol. We enter the mitochondria and thus begins the next 8 chemical reactions. Glycolysis had a nice beginning, glucose, and end, pyruvate. Citric acid cycle doesn't have a nice beginning and a nice end. It's a cycle. The acetyl-CoA will mix up with oxaloacetate and then go through a series of 8 chemical reactions to release some ATP, but again, not too much, a net of 2 once again, but a lot of electrons. I'm not asking you to know every single step of the citric acid cycle. We'll save that for a biology class. But I want you to know through these 8 chemical reactions, you get the production of ATP and some little electrons that will attach to the shuttles and travel on to the electron transport chain. The electron shuttles can either be the NAD or FAD. These electrons will travel to the membrane of the mitochondria. So we're still in the mitochondria, the respiratory center of the cell, but we're now on the membrane. On this membrane will be tons of complex protein pumps that will pump the electrons in and outside of the mitochondria. That pumping action actually produces quite a bit of ATP, 34 ATPs in this metabolism pathway. So you have the sugar, the glucose molecule, enters the cell, goes through 12 chemical reactions to become pyruvate. Through these 12 chemical reactions, you get the production of 2 ATP. The pyruvate gets changed into acetyl-CoA within the mitochondria and enters the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. You go through 8 chemical reactions and get the release of several electrons and some ATP, another 2. All the electrons from the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, enter the electron transport chain, get pumped in and out of the mitochondrial membrane, and you have a production of 34 ATP. For each glucose molecule, you end up with 36 to 38 ATPs. That's glucose metabolism. 3 pathways, 3 sets of chemical reactions. It relates to the type of physical activity. If you're doing an aerobic sport, something where you can breathe constantly, you're going to produce energy through the aerobic pathway. You're going to last a lot longer because you can produce a lot more ATPs. If it's a high-intensity, short activity, you're producing energy through the anaerobic pathway, and you're only going to be able to produce energy for a short amount of time. All right, we've gone through carbohydrate metabolism. I promise that's the most extensive one. But we still have to see how the body changes triglycerides and amino acids into energy it can use. Continue on with the other videos.